Hello, Sage class. Today we're going to move on from the Golden Age of Athens to an exploration of early Christianity, and in particular, the life of Jesus and the Gospels. Before turning to the Gospels themselves, it's important for us to understand the context of Jesus' life, and so we'll look at the geography of the world in which Jesus lived first. On the left, you see the map of Palestine, the area of the Promised Land, once called Israel and Judah, is now Palestine. I want to point out to you a few of the key locations in Palestine relative to Jesus' life and ministry. First, Nazareth. This is Jesus' hometown, and Galilee is the area where a significant portion of Jesus' ministry took place. We also see two other important cities. One, Jerusalem. It is the capital city of Judah, of the people of Israel. It is also the location of the temple and the holy city of the Hebrew people. It is where Jesus was crucified. Finally, you see the city of Bethlehem. This is the city of David. It is the city where King David originally came from, and also the place where the Gospels of Matthew and Luke say that Jesus was born in order to show that he was the Messiah, the descendant of David, who would again take the throne of David, be the true king of Israel. Next, let's think a little bit about the historical context. Remember, the Hebrew people were defeated by the Babylonians and went into exile. In 483, the Persians defeated Babylon and allowed the people of Israel to return to Judea and rebuild the temple. About 75, 80 years later, Alexander the Great defeated the then known world and is responsible for the then known world turning to Greek as the key language. That is the language that the New Testament is written in. In 166 BCE, there was the Maccabean revolt in which Judah gained its independence, but it only lasted for a little over 100 years when the Roman Empire finally conquered Palestine. And the Roman Empire reigned over Palestine throughout the time of Jesus' life. The last thing that I will tell you about is that in 66 through 73 CE, there was a Jewish rebellion against the Roman Empire, in which Rome defeated the Jews. The Second Temple was destroyed, and the Jewish people scattered once again. So let's think about the cultural and religious context of Jesus' time a little bit. What was Palestine like under the Roman Empire? The Roman Empire, which you see in the map, covered the pretty much then known world, stretched from Portugal through all of Europe into Palestinian region and throughout North Africa. Right, and the Roman way of rule was to allow local rulers to rule under the patronage of Rome. That is to say, Rome was really in control. The local rulers were simply puppets of the Roman Empire who had their power through the Roman Empire. Throughout the known world at the time, then, imperial legions or the imperial army existed to maintain peace and order. And so in Palestine, there were Roman centurions and legions there to keep the peace and maintain order. Romans allowed each of their subject nations to maintain their cultural and religious traditions as long as they recognized Roman political authority and participated in Roman religious practices. At the time, as in Uruk under Gilgamesh, politics and religion were closely intertwined. And so the Roman emperor was considered divine, a god of sorts, and thus should be worshipped in all of the different cultures under the Roman Empire. But this created a problem for the Jews, right? A problem in Palestine. The polytheism of the Roman Empire came into conflict with the monotheism of Judaism. Judaism only recognized one God, a God of the whole universe, rather than many gods. And so the Jews were unwilling to add new gods to their religion, right? They would not worship the emperor, and they would not place statues of the Roman gods and goddesses in their temple. This made the Romans particularly frustrated with the Jews because they would not recognize the political and religious authority of the Romans. And the Jews were constantly frustrated and opposed to Rome because Rome seemed to try to impose its religion on the Jewish people. Right. So some of the different religious groups during the time of Jesus, and there on the right you see a picture of the temple, the second temple that was in existence during the time of Jesus. First, King Herod, who reigned over Palestine. He and the aristocracy, that is the ruling class, collaborated with the Roman Empire. They had their power and their authority and their wealth because the Roman Empire found them convenient. And as long as they did what the Romans wanted, collect taxes, maintain control, etc., they were happy with the aristocracy. So King Herod was a collaborator with Rome. The Sadducees were the priests who maintained the temple, which you see at the right there. They didn't like the Roman Empire, but they felt as long as they were free to maintain the worship of God in the temple through the offerings and rituals, they were fulfilling God's will. And so they kept the Roman authorities at arm's length, but also did not try to tried to cooperate with them to the extent possible, so that they could maintain the temple and worship in the temple. The Pharisees were a religious group that came into greatest conflict with Jesus throughout his ministry. The Pharisees focused on daily obedience to the law of God, and they called all people to follow the law of God rigorously as a way to maintain their relationship with God despite the presence of the Roman Empire. The Zealots were those radical insurrectionists, revolutionaries, who were seeking God's reign through the use of violent revolution, trying to kick the Roman Empire out of Palestine through the use of violence. And finally, there were the ordinary Jewish people, poor agriculturalists or farmers, who were weighed down by the heavy burdens of Roman taxes and their Jewish religious obligations. These are the ones who embraced Jesus and saw him as bringing a new possibility to the people, as opposed to King Herod, who was a collaborator with Rome, the Sadducees, who were focused on the temple and its worship, the Pharisees, who were focused on obedience to God's law, and the Zealots, who were trying to overthrow the Roman Empire through violence. Jewish people, on the whole, were just trying to survive under the heavy burdens placed upon them. Now let's turn to the Gospels, the stories of Jesus' life. These are broken down into two groups. One, the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. They are called the Synoptic Gospels because they are all related. Mark is the first of the Gospels written. Then Matthew and Luke build upon Mark's Gospel, taking the basic format of Mark and adding things to it to serve their own purposes and the message they wanted to communicate about Jesus. John, the Gospel of John, if you look at it, is a very different story than each of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So let's start with the Synoptic Gospels. Mark, as I said, is the first one written, sometime between 40 and 75 CE, that is, in the Christian era. Now we've made the jump over from BCE, before the Christian era, or before the Common Era, to CE, the Common Era, or the Christian era. And Mark was written for a Gentile community of Christians. And a few of the characteristics of it that help us to understand the audience are that there are very few biblical quotations, because the Gentiles did not recognize the authority of the Torah or the Hebrew Bible. There are Jewish customs and terms are explained or defined. And finally, the story of Jesus told in Mark is an attempt to help the people deal with the persecution they were under. In those early days of Christianity, the Christians found themselves persecuted by both the Jewish leaders who wanted to stamp out this new movement, and by the Roman Empire itself, who saw the Christian movement as a threat to their authority. So, in response to this, as the Christians were being martyred and oppressed by those around them, they told the story of Jesus in a way that tries to show God's power over all things. The Matthew and Luke were each written sometime between 65 CE and 110 CE, but written to somewhat different audiences. Matthew was written to a Jewish community of Christians, those a group of Jews who were converted to Christianity. And what we see there is that it focuses on the way in which Jesus was the fulfillment of the Hebrew Scriptures. Um, but this, in order to convince this Greek-speaking Jewish community that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, the fulfillment of the promises in the Hebrew Bible that a Messiah would come who would be a true and good king and renew the people of Israel. We see in Matthew also that it is clear that it is written after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and that it is far enough along in the development of early Christianity for there to be sort of church offices and a church order arising, because in Matthew talks about how the early church should be organized. Finally, Luke, which is written somewhere around the same time period, but to a different audience, is written for a mixed Jewish and Gentile community. By the time of Luke, uh, both Jews and Gentiles, by Gentiles we mean anyone who's not a Jew, right, were gathering together as followers of Jesus. And this gospel is written particularly for such a group. We can see this in the way in which Luke is placed in a larger global context of the Roman Empire, right? It's not just concerned with Jewish history and Jewish scriptures. Rather, it's concerned with everyone in the known world. And it is focused on inclusion of the Gentiles and other outsiders into God's kingdom. Okay, so those are the synoptic gospels. Just by way of review, Mark is the first gospel written, and then Matthew and Luke build upon that foundation of Mark and add their own additions to it in order to speak to the particular community that they are writing their gospel for. John, the Gospel of John, is written somewhat later than the other Gospels, or perhaps later, and has little overlap with the Synoptic Gospels. It has longer narratives with more dialogue. It is fundamentally theological about the relationship between God and Jesus rather than what Jesus is doing in the world, and there is a clear mixing of Jewish and Greek ideas and traditions. So let's talk for just briefly about the Gospel of Mark. It is the shortest and the simplest gospel. There is no birth narrative. It simply opens with the baptism of Jesus. That is the first event in the Gospel of Mark. The second thing is that there are no appearances of Jesus after the resurrection in the oldest versions, just an empty tomb. And this gospel focuses on Jesus' miracles and deeds of power rather than Jesus' teachings. That is to say, that God's kingdom and God's power is breaking into the world in order to bring about a fundamental change. You can see how this would be very comforting to those Christians facing persecution. Uh, in those early days of Christianity, because what it communicated is God's power and God's might and God's kingdom have broken into the world, and no matter how powerful the kingdoms of this world appear, they are no match for God's kingdom. Okay, so just a sort of outline of the basic Gospel of Mark. At the beginning of the Gospel, Mark makes clear what Jesus' mission is. He comes and he preaches that the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God is at hand, repent and believe in the gospel. And gospel simply means good news. Then Jesus is on the move, doing miracles that reveal the power of God that is breaking into the world to renew God's purposes. He is healing the sick, feeding the hungry, casting out demons, uh, setting the world right the way God intended it. Right? Jesus teaches in a limited way in this gospel, but teaches mostly through parables. Parables that are designed to both reveal and to hide the truth. So that the parables are only for those insiders, those people who see and know that Jesus is the power of God that can defeat all the kingdoms of this world. Right? Jesus is opposed by the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Herodians in the Gospel of Mark, each of whom want to protect their own authority and power against the authority of Jesus and the kingdom of God. Interestingly, in this gospel, Jesus' disciples are largely blundering fools who do not understand Jesus' mission and who end up betraying him, abandoning him, and denying him. They do not end up looking very good throughout the gospel. We also see that a large part of the gospel is committed to Jesus going to Jerusalem to confront the powers of this world. In his entrance into Jerusalem, he enters like a triumphant king who rides on a donkey and rides into the city like a conquering hero with the people crying out, Son of David, uh, and ruler or king of Israel. He then also takes control of the temple, clearing out the temple and showing that he has authority over the Sadducees. Then, at Passover, remember we've talked about Passover and what it celebrates, setting the people free from slavery. Jesus eats the Passover meal with his disciples and claims that he is the Passover lamb, giving him the bread as a representation of his body that is broken for them, giving them the wine as a sign of his blood, which is shed for them. And then he is arrested. He is convicted of religious and political crimes, and he is executed on a cross, which is the Roman punishment appropriate for insurrectionists. Across the top of the Jesus cross, they put King of the Jews as a way to show what they are killing him for. They see him as an enemy of the state because he claims to be the king of the Jews. He dies and is placed in the tomb, and then 3 days later, the women visit the tomb, but it is empty. There is a young man sitting in the tomb, and he tells them that Jesus has risen risen, and that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him. But in the oldest version of Mark, that is where the gospel ends. Just the promise that Jesus is going before you. Later on, some additions were made to the Gospel of Mark because people didn't find that ending satisfying. They wanted an appearance of Jesus. But the oldest manuscripts, Jesus never makes an appearance after his resurrection. Just the empty tomb and the promise that he goes before you. Okay, let's turn to the Gospel of Matthew then, which is written for Jewish Christians. And there we see he takes the basic format of Mark, the basic narrative of Mark, and adds certain things to it, such as a birth narrative, right? Just having gone through Christmas, you probably have paid some attention to this birth narrative recently. In Matthew, there is a genealogy of Jesus. A genealogy is the list of one's ancestors, right? In this genealogy, in Matthew, traces Jesus' lineage back to Abraham, right? Remember, Abraham is the father of the Hebrew people. And so clearly this genealogy is trying to show that Jesus is part of the Jewish people and, in fact, the fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham, right? In this birth narrative is focused on Joseph and what he does, because Joseph is a descendant of King David. And Joseph and Mary live in Bethlehem, and Jesus is born in Bethlehem, the city of David, right? Showing his connection once again to King David. There he is visited by wise men from the east who saw a star that proclaimed the birth of a new king. We also see that King Herod wants to kill this new king because this new king is a threat to his power. Then Joseph takes his family to Egypt to escape King Herod, and after King Herod dies, Joseph and his family return to Palestine, but they settle in Nazareth because they fear that Bethlehem will be too dangerous. So here we see Jesus being placed in the context of the history of the Jewish people, the connection with Abraham, the connection with the people of Israel going into Egypt and coming back out, the connection with King David. All of these things are attempts to show that Jesus is the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel. Another key feature in these birth narratives is the way in which Matthew uses Hebrew scriptures and the promises in the Hebrew scriptures to show that Jesus is the fulfillment of those scriptures. So for one example is in Matthew 1, 22 and 23, where it says, all of this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. All right, so what I want you to get out of this section of Matthew is the way in which the birth narrative is placed there to show Jesus' connection with and fulfillment of God's promises to the Jewish people. Second place that we see this is a section on the teachings of Jesus that are added by Matthew. And this is the famous Sermon on the Mount that takes place in Matthew 5:1 through 7:29. There, Jesus teaches from a mountaintop, okay, where he is sort of presented like Moses on Mount Sinai, receiving the law from God. And there, Jesus says, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." In other words, Jesus is fulfilling uh, the Hebrew religion. He isn't changing anything. He's fulfilling it. He's not turning his back on Judaism. He is the fulfillment of Judaism. And as you know, at the heart of Judaism is God's law. But Jesus reinterprets and radicalizes that law. He says, "You have heard it said, but I say to you," repeatedly, right? And this is Jesus reinterpreting the law. Others have interpreted it this way: "You have heard it said, but I'm telling you the truth about the law. But I say to you." Let's take one example from Matthew 5:21 through 22. "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder,' and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says 'you fool' will be liable to the hell of fire." In other words, we know that one of the 10 Commandments is "do not murder," right? But Jesus is taking it a step further. He's saying it's not just about refraining from killing people, it's about your attitude towards your neighbor, right? If you become angry with your neighbor, if you insult your neighbor, if um, you are cruel to your neighbor, that is the same thing as murder, right? So Jesus uh, reinterprets and radicalizes the law, right? It is more than just refraining from murder. It has to do with an inner attitude towards your neighbor. Okay? Then, towards the end of the Sermon on the Mount, it says, "And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished by his teachings, for he taught as one who had authority, and not as the scribes." Right? So Jesus here is like Moses, who brings a word from God directly to the people, who presents the law to the people. And I hope you see in both this presentation of Matthew's birth narrative and of the Sermon on the Mount, the way in which the way in which the author of this gospel takes the story of Mark and begins to remold it and reshape it to fit his own purpose, which is to show Jesus as the fulfillment of uh, the Hebrew religion, the Jewish religion. Now let's look briefly to the Gospel of Luke. Here we see, I'm trying to get back to the